Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the forum on the intersection of data technology with humanity, the plight of health disparities. My name is John Anderson. I'm the Dean of the College of Engineering and Architecture at Howard University, and we welcome you. This is a collaboration with REI Systems, and we look forward to working with them to provide programming that is of interest to you. We have two guests who will provide information that I believe many of you will find helpful. We are pleased to be a part of this effort. At Howard University, we have 5 departments in our College of Engineering and Architecture. We have the Department of Architecture, Civil and Environmental Engineering, Chemical Engineering, Electrical Engineering and Computer Science, and Mechanical Engineering. We are a growing college. Our computer science programs, like many other institutions, are our most popular programs. And we are looking forward to educating our students, preparing them for research opportunities, employment opportunities, and the dynamic fields related to engineering and architecture. Again, thank you for joining us in this forum. And please turn your attention to Shyam Salona from REI Systems.
Thank you, Dean Anderson. It's a pleasure to be collaborating with Howard University to host this event. I just want to take a few minutes to set the context and then introduce the topic and our distinguished speakers. The purpose of these events is primarily 2 objectives. One is to strengthen the community around government IT, provide opportunity to share successes and challenges, find peers who have faced the same issues, and you know where to look when you want to help or seek help. The second objective is to help government better get to know and take advantage of the resources in our immediate neighborhood at Howard University and cross-fertilize in terms of offering case studies and expertise from government and provide a richer experience for young and emerging technologists. I'll just take a brief moment to introduce REI, which I co-founded, and I'm the CEO 30 years ago. At REI, our mission is to leverage technology that help public sector missions and improve millions of lives. Over the last 30 years, we had the privilege to serve 25 agencies and critical public sector missions across all kinds of domains such as health and human services, homeland security and public safety, research and development, etc. We believe that collaboration between academia, government, and the private sector is vital for us to make progress. So that's why we organize such events. And so let me now introduce today's topic. As we all know, AI is starting to play a huge role in our society. And given the pandemic, it's becoming even more important that this technology that was supposed to help us make better decisions quickly and reduce effort also has an opposite, a dangerous side in terms of how it impacts the minority health and health disparities. So that's what the topic is. And we are honored to have 2 distinguished speakers. I would like to introduce them. Dr. Christine Lee, Strategic Research Engagement Lead at the FDA, Commissioner's Office of Minority Health and Health Equity. She has a doctorate in pharmaceutical outcomes and policy from University of Florida and doctorate of pharmacy from University of Buffalo. Dr. Lee will be speaking on how to advance health equity by leveraging research and collaboration. Our second speaker is Dr. Deborah Duran, Director of Science Policy Legislation, Strategic Planning and Assessment at the NIH National Institute for Minority Health and Health Disparities. She has a PhD in social psychology from the University of Denver and an MS in computer science from Nova Southeastern University. Dr. Duran will provide a comprehensive look at the diversity gaps in data science that underlie and drives AI technology, and also share best practices on addressing the biases and disparities that are present in the data. So from a logistics standpoint, we'll have Dr. Lee and Dr. Duran speak for about 20 minutes, and then they will be available to answer questions. I would encourage you, as they are speaking, to post your question in the GoToWebinar questions window as it comes to your mind. And I'll ask my colleague Jeff Myers, once the speakers have completed their presentation, to monitor these questions, and then we'll start to bring these questions for discussion with our panelists, the two speakers. So with that, I'll hand it over to Dr. Lee. Dr. Lee, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Siam. It's great to be here. So today I'll be talking about leveraging research and collaboration to advance health equity. Next slide, please. The disclaimer is that these conflicts, I have no conflicts of interest to declare, and these presentation slides represent only my opinion. Next slide, please. So who are we? What is the Food and Drug Administration? What do we do? So our mission is that the FDA is responsible for protecting the public health by assuring the safety, efficacy, and security of human and veterinary drugs, biologic products, medical devices, our nation's food supply, cosmetics, and products that emit radiation. And I know that Howard University is not that far away, so please come visit us after COVID pandemic is over. Next slide, please. So what do we do from the Office of Minority Health and Health Equity standpoint? Our mission is to promote and protect the health of diverse populations through two separate arms, the research arm and the communication arm, that addresses health disparities. And our vision is one to create a world where health equity is a reality for all. Next slide, please. We have three overarching goals in our office. The first goal is to improve regulatory science by increasing the clinical trial data available on racial and ethnic minorities, improve data quality to determine how minorities react to medical products, and also to increase the transparency and access to available data. The next goal here is to strengthen FDA's ability to respond to minority health concerns. And our third goal, to promote the health and safety communication to minority populations who often experience low health literacy and or may not speak English as their first language. Next slide, please. So as mentioned a little bit earlier, we have two arms within our office, our research and collaboration arm and our outreach and communication arm. In our research and collaboration arm, we have several activities, including intramural research, extramural research, which I will go into more details in the next couple of slides. I'll also highlight some of our CIRCE projects. CIRCE stand for Centers of Excellence in Regulatory Science and Innovation. Our broad agency announcement, which I will also describe in a couple more slides, and other research opportunities. I'll also be highlighting some of our internships and fellowships that we have available, and also some of the academic collaborations that we have with academic institutions, nonprofits, and other diverse organizations. In our outreach and communication arm, we focus on culturally and linguistically tailored programs, initiatives, and apologies. This is the town hall at my home with the board ringing. Give me 1 second, please. Programs, initiatives, and campaigns, including diversity and clinical trial initiatives. We have a language access program. We have health education materials, social media, newsletters and e-alerts, websites. We also hold health equity lecture series and webinars, and also we do hold public meetings. Next slide, please. So as promised, I'm going to go over some examples of our extramural collaboration and research projects. As you can see, we do leverage multiple mechanisms in order for us to connect to extramural partners and researchers. And this can include examples such as IAAs, which are interagency agreements, RCAs, which are research collaborative agreements. We hold public workshops. As mentioned earlier, we also work through our Centers of Excellence, or CERCs, and we also work through our contracting mechanism, also called broad agency announcements. Next slide, please. I'm going to go over one of our fellowship programs that's currently open at the moment, and please apply if you have an interest. Next slide, please. Our current fellowship is actually a joint collaborative fellowship that we have with NIH, NHGRI. So this is a National Human Genome Research Institute, and it's a partnership between their office and our office at the FDA. Our application process is currently ongoing and is expected to close early summer. Next slide, please. So what does this postdoctoral fellowship involve in genomic science and health equity? It's a fellowship that will be in collaboration with 3 PIs spanning both between the NIH and FDA, with Dr. Bodine, Maria Rios, and Camille West. The focus on this fellowship will be to pursue a genomics research related to sickle cell disease. As we all know, sickle cell disease is a health disparity condition that primarily affects African Americans in the United States. The candidate will actually complete a research project that will produce reference reagents for blood group genotyping, which will optimize transfusion support for patients with sickle cell disease. Next slide, please. We also work with other government agencies through mechanisms called IAAs, which is intra-agency agreements. I'm going to highlight one of our IAAs that we have with the VA right now. Next slide, please. So within this intra-agency agreement, the IAA is focused on a collaborative project between us, the Center for Drugs, also called CDER, and also the VA, the Veteran Health Administration, in which we're looking at any subgroup differences in outcomes based off of race and ethnicity, really understanding DOAC treatment options, or outcomes, sorry. DOAC stands for direct oral anticoagulants. Next slide, please. Another mechanism that the FDA works with is through CERCs, our Centers of Excellence. Next slide, please. An example of our CERC project that we have with UCSF is understanding the use of virtual reality for pain management among diverse patients. We're looking into to see if VR is a feasible or an effective approach for pain management in a real-world setting serving diverse low-income patients. Next slide, please. An RCA that I will highlight with this group today, or a research collaborative agreement, is with the nonprofit, the Hepatitis B Foundation. Next slide, please. So within this research collaborative agreement between the Office of Minority Health and Health Equity and Hepatitis B Foundation is understanding barriers to hepatitis B clinical trials, looking into what are the barriers, attitudes, and beliefs to enrolling diverse patients into hepatitis B clinical trials. Next slide, please. And as mentioned a little bit earlier too, our contracting mechanism that we have access to, called the broad agency announcement, also allows us to partner with research entities. Next slide, please. One of the broad agency announcements that we have is with a research entity to look at social listening for patient perspectives on chronic pain. The goal for this is to explore and analyze chronic pain disease and treatment lexicon in order to better understand the chronic pain patient experience. Next slide. I'm now going to go into some of our own office work. So we recently published an article called Assessment of Public and Patient Online Comments in Social Media and Food and Drug Administration Archival Data. I'm just going to go over the high-level concepts in this paper. If you're interested, please read it, but I won't go into the nitty-gritty based off of time. Next slide, please. So the concept for this research work actually came to me around 10 years ago. When I was a PhD student at the University of Florida, I had a great time there. I was in the midst of my qualitative data analysis and also survey methodology on the quantitative side. And I found out that my baby at that time was going to have some health complications. Now, during this time, I felt very fortunate that I had access to healthcare professionals. You know, coming from a healthcare background, I knew where to look. But even then, I was missing information that extended beyond the textbook. So here, I really needed to know, as a parent, what is it like raising a child with a complication? Where do I go for information as a parent? How can I gain support from other people in my similar situation? And from this standpoint, what I really did was I went beyond the textbooks and I went beyond the professional care and I went into social media to find other parents who are going through something similar like me. And from there, I started to understand that the patient experience was shared on multiple different platforms than just between the physician and the patient. And this really got me going to understand, well, if this social media platform for myself was so informative and I was able to connect and find a community of other parents living with a similar situation, what else can I find from this? Next slide, please. So thus began my exploration 10 years ago into social listening to really understand what can we gain from listening to social media. Where is it that people are having conversations where they can share their experiences and gain different perspectives and gain knowledge that they may not be able to gain in other places? And the other thing that I realized was that as I was looking at the social media data, I realized I was looking at my focus group transcripts at the same time. And to me, it dawned to me that both of these transcripts that I was looking at were narrative in nature. So I wondered, could I not apply the same qualitative research methodology that I was using on my focus group transcripts and apply them onto social media, in which the data is also unstructured and narrative, to try to pull out the themes and understanding of what is really meaningful to people and what their unmet needs are. Next slide, please. Now, this is an example I like to give, but I want to always preface it with that it is a hypothetical example because I just don't think it's going to happen. But in this hypothetical example, if my son, who is now 10 years old, started to fail math, would I, as a parent, only ask his math teacher on why he is failing math? And let's say I hear from his one source, his math teacher, that he is failing math because he hates math. Would I then take this one piece of information and then run with it to then disenroll him from every math class moving forward? Or would I, as a parent, look for various data sources to understand what is going on, to try to find the totality of information before I make a decision? Would I ask his teacher? Would I ask his friends? Would I ask himself? Would I ask his coach? Would I ask his father? Why is it that Aiden, my 10-year-old, is failing math? Now let's say that we hear from multiple data sources that Aiden has a crush on Sarah, and Sarah sits in front of him in math class. So maybe it isn't the fact that he hates math, but that there was a distraction, and maybe he should move to a different math class or sit in front of Sarah. So using this type of logical thinking, I started wondering, can I apply the same type of logic to my research? Next slide, please. In which it really dawned on me that when we look at FDA data, maybe people do not know how to communicate with the agency, or maybe the agency is incredibly intimidating. So when we look at our data sources, when we look at FDA data, and I'm looking at public meetings, I'm looking at advisory committee meetings, docket comments, PSED, focus groups, I'm looking at this data, but in the back of my mind, I'm wondering, is this really the voices, all of the voices that we should be listening to? Or is this a subset of voices that we're hearing? What about communities that don't read Federal Register notice? What if we have communities that don't have the resources to fly to the agency and come and visit the agency? What if we have communities that may not know how to engage with the agency? Now, where are those voices? Which then led me to look into social media data some more. So it reminded me of the work that I had started about 10 years ago, in which I was like, what if we pull out social media data to listen also, to see with the same concept that I used in my hypothetical example, look at various data sources to understand what is going on out there. Where are the unmet needs? Where are the voices? What are the voices saying? And maybe when the voices overlap, as you can see here in topics A, B, and C, maybe these are very important voices that we should be listening to, or topics that have emerged to the surface. But at the same time, it's incredibly important to not ignore topic F, G, and H, in which it could be that these communities may not know how to communicate with the agency. Maybe they are vulnerable populations, or maybe the topic is a stigmatized topic in which people may not be comfortable coming to the agency to share, or the fact that we might be missing social context altogether. Next slide, please. So here's an example of the methodology that was used to capture the unstructured data, the narrative data, in both the FDA and social media. So once again, both types of data sources were unstructured in nature. Next slide, please. And an example of the results that we saw, and this was for one of the rare diseases, we saw that the patient voices that were online and were the strongest were actually parents of young children who had this rare disease. And it could be then, what I found for myself, that when I was in a time of need and I really needed to find out information quite desperately, I myself went onto social media as a parent. So understanding that there are different sources of information and going to those sources of information so we can hear and understand different populations is incredibly important, and not to neglect voices. Next slide, please. And that's all. Thank you so very much. I'm looking forward to questions, and I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Duran.
My name is Deborah Duran. I am the Senior Advisor for Data Science and Analytics at the National Institute of Minority Health and Health Disparities, which is part of the National Institutes of Health. Next. What I'm going to talk to you today about is sort of the idea of humanity touching IT. And as was said at the beginning, what we have come to learn is that it has opened our eyes to many biases that IT has. So I'm going to talk first about the humanity part of this, and then about the technology part. Next. And as I said, the IT is presenting to us that we have, because it processes so quickly, that there are hidden harms. Next. First, I want to show you a little bit of data to highlight health disparities from colors of COVID. Next. As you can see, and this is the most recent data, the people of color, Indigenous, Native Americans, Blacks, and Pacific Islanders are dying at higher rates than whites. Next. When we look at the actual numbers, of course, whites outnumber the rest of the population groups, so it looks different. But in when you look at rate ratios by 100, this number out of 1,000, you see that we're disproportionately dying. Next. And part of the reason that we've come to know that is because of the social determinants of health, and that the social determinants of health also drive the inequities that are found in health disparities. Next. And in fact, the social determinants of health actually constitute approximately 80% of our health rather than the healthcare system itself. So it's not only what we do, but it's the physical environment that we live and the socioeconomic factors that are around us, like our education, our school, our family support, our community safety. Next. These are just some examples of what are social determinants of health in these different realms. Our individual behavior, we have a physical environment as well as a socio-cultural environment. And then the clinical events and healthcare systems also gets into what we call structural racism or structural isms. And so these all combined together impact our health. And this is where the social determinants of health have now risen in visibility as an important factor to look in healthcare. Next. And this is where the humanity part of this comes from, is we have to see the human in people, not just their race or the biases that we have. Next. So let's look at, and this is what my institute focuses on, is what is minority health versus health disparities? Could you click that again so the definition comes up for health disparities? Thank you. So in minority health, it's really looking at the health of a specific population group. Health disparities is looking at adverse differences in health between population groups. And we look at this beyond minorities. So this is why health disparities includes other populations besides minorities. So we will also look at low SES and rural. And recently, sexual gender minorities were added to this as well. Next. This was something my institute and NIH did approximately 5 years ago, is that health disparities was all over the place and no one really knew the definition of it, and they mixed social determinants within the definitions of health disparities. And so all of you in technology know you cannot, and science know you can't, a cause is not the same thing as an outcome. So we separated them and we came up with these 5 outcomes: higher incidence and prevalence, premature excessive mortality, greater burden of disease, poor health behaviors and clinical outcomes, and worse outcomes or validated self-reported measures on our daily functioning. So these are the focus of all the research that is done in health disparities at NIH. So why is technology important? Next. We can skip this because that was already done. Next. Why is health disparities important in a high-tech society? And the reason for that is it can, at this point, either close the gap of health disparities, meaning if you look back on the charts with COVID, the difference between where whites are versus where people of color are, or it can widen those gaps. And the reason for this is because of the high volume of data that does not include marginalized population variables such as race and ethnicity, income, education. Without these kinds of variables, the social determinants of health and the demographics were going to be left out of these analyses. And now we have to understand why. Next. Because the cost of health inequities is astronomical. It's $35 billion in excess healthcare expenditures because people go to healthcare late when they don't have insurance, and therefore their cost is through emergency rooms rather than regular care, and the cost surmounts. Next. And the other reason this is important is because right now, especially on the coast, whites are about the same percentage as minority groups collectively. Even though whites dominate or still have the numbers that dominate, the demographics are changing. Actually, Asian Americans are the fastest growing immigration group. The Hispanics have declined. And both Asian and Hispanic numbers are surpassing, well, Hispanic has already surpassed the percentage of African Americans in this country, and soon Asians will surpass the number of African Americans as well. And the other populations, we have SGM, which is about 5% of the population, and we have a growing number of people living in poverty. Next. Why is this important? In looking at this, I alluded to a little bit ago, is because there's so much missing data. There's also no common data elements. And when we don't have the common data elements, we cannot aggregate data across different data sets. So for instance, we can't link census data with ACS data, with National Center of Health Statistics data, with electronic health records data, because there's no common metrics to do that. We also don't have a very good understanding of what constitutes a health disparity. Next. And the reason that some of these biases occur in these data sets and in the science that we have now is because of this one part of humanity. Humans are prone to biases, all of us. It doesn't matter the color of our skin, it doesn't matter our age, it doesn't matter where we are born. We are prone to biases. Next. And these biases are often and mostly unconscious, and so they come out as implicit biases versus those where it's blatant, and that's called explicit biases. But for most of us, we function with unconscious biases. Next. And so let's talk a little bit about the types of biases, because we have to raise our awareness, because biases are not just a white person's issue. It's everyone's issue. Next. One, these are the 5 types of biases that there are. One is a groupthink. In other words, we try to pressure everyone around us to think as we do. Confirmation bias is when we associate ourselves with people who think like us, who reinforce our beliefs, who become our echoes because we like to be with people who are like us. Blind spot biases is we don't even recognize that we're feeling we have myths or misperceptions about particular groups or people or events. And so it becomes a blind spot, and it becomes an implicit bias. And stereotypes. we have prejudgments of what people are and who they are as a group, and we tend to put those on individuals. And then affinity bias. Again, we prefer to be with people like us in thought and sometimes in phenotype or the way we look. Next. All of those biases comes out in these isms. And we have lots of isms, not just racism. And all of these isms end up in discrimination. And with this discrimination, we then carry it forward in the technology work that we do. Next. In order to stop this, before you start your technology projects, you have to think, check, change, and become bias busters so that you look at an entire 360 view of a project rather than what your limited view is. Next. Because this automated technology can either widen the gap or narrow the gap of health disparities. Next. And the reason I touched on this, because all data bias is rooted by human bias. And we carry all of these biases and perspectives that we have into what we do when we select our data sets, when we design our projects, and when we conduct the analysis that we do. Next. What's also very interesting about this is that with technology, we tend to be blindly accepting of it. And there's always these jokes about, well, if it's on the internet, it must be true. And so we tend to believe technology over humans. And in humans, we suspect the bias, but in technology, we do not. And therefore, we are often victims of the biases in technology. Next. This is just a few examples because I don't think anyone to date has ever designed a project to intentionally do bias types of results, but they do happen. And these are just a few examples. Next. So in moving into the technology piece of this, in design bias, we are looking at what data sets do we bring together? How are we think of the hypothesis? What questions are we thinking of? All of these lead to what the results will be in that project. Next. And this is where we select our data. We look at what ethics will ultimately result, and we look at it either from a technical perspective or from a user perspective. Next. And one of the ways to combat this bias, and notice the gold star, everywhere you see a gold star on these, this is a solution to the issue. And so when you're designing your projects, look for a person-focused design. Look for what the impact will have on a person. Next. This is one of the biggest issues, and this is data curation. In other words, the common data elements, the missing data, and most important, when we have these big data sets, we impute the data, and that in itself creates biases. And I'll go through each one of these next. So the missing data, you know that algorithms in machine learning use petabytes, terabytes, massive amounts of data. And in all of these data sets, when there is missing data, these algorithms don't work correctly. So consequently, people have to generate fake data in order to make the algorithms work. Next. So in order to do that, they've developed a process where they impute data. And when you impute data, you are creating what we call synthetic data or digital twins. In other words, you take what is there and you regenerate it, almost like clone it, so that you have fake people in your studies rather than the actual people. Next. And when you do this, you're trying to get enough enough power in order to make the simulation work or the algorithm to work. But next, when you create these digital twins, they're a virtual model. They're not the real thing. And so studies have shown that they are close in proximity to what the real thing is, but they are still very different. And when you're talking about precision medicine and providing healthcare, you have to be more accurate. Next. Another very important piece in data is that data changes constantly because society changes constantly. But when we do analysis, we often think of data as being permanent. Well, life is not permanent. Many of us have witnessed this in the last couple of years where the data handling and concept drifts have changed drastically. So there are ways that you can test for this before you use the data. And these are just some examples like SkyKit or adaptive windowing. But be conscious of this and do this periodically in every study that you do. Next. There's also feature extraction biases, meaning we now are imputing data from, or aggregating data from many different sources, whether it's social media, traditional data sets, telemedicine data, wearable data, and we put it all together. And when we put it all together, it also has its own interpretation and its own meaning. What happens then is that we have a bias of judgment of what these mean when they're put together. Next. So we just need to be mindful of all of these different types of biases so that when we create algorithms, that they apply to everyone and not just one particular population group, and that we are reflecting the entire socio-cultural environment of whatever study that we are using algorithms to do. And that includes doing diagnostics and doing treatments. Next. Keep in mind that bad data is always the foundation of algorithm bias. And although algorithms in itself can have bias, that the root of the algorithm bias is often in the data bias. Next. So again, algorithm biases are only as good as the data that you put into them. Next. And again, there are many different repercussions and hidden harms that have been done in the use of algorithms. These are just a few of them where I think it was Google who was doing algorithm bias for hiring and geared more towards white men than women. There's just biases in skin cancer care where they can detect skin cancer in white men 90% of the time and 34% of the time in African American women. So we have to be conscious of the outputs that these biases are doing. And these can be fixed if we can identify the patterns of bias that results. Next. Because they result in the loss of opportunity, economic loss, social loss, and these hidden harms have long-term impacts that will widen health disparities. So as we move forward with this, we have to stay conscious of these biases. Next. Because under the King Midas problem, that it always exists. And I disagree with that. Even though we will always have human biases and machine learning will always generate something that is off for some people, as long as we stay accountable, we will be able to address these issues. And by accountable, I mean transparent in what we do and have diversity at the table. Next. We'll skip this. This is just another way to deal with drift. Now, keep in mind that when you develop an algorithm in machine learning, that algorithm is what we train the model with in AI. So if you have bad data or biased data, and you create a biased algorithm, you now are training biased models. And the biases can not be the fault of the training aspect of it, but you can often identify those biases as you're training if you do checks in order to see that there's patterns of biases that are starting to emerge. And so many people think, oh, they're not being trained right. Well, they're not being trained right because of all these other precursors that are happening beforehand. Next. So again, in training your data set, please remember that the end user is the most important. Look at it from how will it impact the population. Look for the lack of representation. Make sure that there's sufficient variables to answer your question. Look at the way that labels from social media and from, well, all the hyperconvergent data, whether it's images, social media, data sets, how they label concepts. When you do that kind of consciousness, you then stop these biases in AI. Next. And when we stop these biases in AI, this comes at the unintended implementation biases, where the one famous example of this is that in kidney allocation they used for kidney transplants, the algorithm, the data sets that they used generated that white females would get a kidney at a higher priority than Black males. But if you know what kidney failure data at all, the highest population group with the most kidney failure are Black males due to APO1 gene. So this algorithm did opposite of what the benefit should have been. So oftentimes in healthcare, these kinds of things can happen unintentionally. But if you pay attention to these biases, you can stop this loss of opportunity, the economic loss, the medical harm, the loss of liberty, etc. Next. We also see in implementation, the natural language processing has had numerous problems in implementation, especially, and the best example I can give you of this is Alexa. And if you try to talk to Alexa and you have an accent or you don't use grammar and pronounce your words correctly, the implementation of what Alexa delivers back to you is nothing what you asked it to do in the first place. And that's the best example that I can give of the errors in natural language processing. Next. So in order to do all of this and be responsible in AI, we have to have fair transparency, inclusiveness, accountability, ensure the privacy and confidentiality of participants, and have safety and reliability. Next. And if we don't do that, we end up with AI bias ethics and on the verge of lawfulness. And where in the United States, there are no national policies for ethics and bias. There is in the UK, but not in the United States. Next. So we have to be able to raise this as a consciousness level as well. Next. Because without it, there's not a trustworthiness in AI. There's not a human trust, there's not a technical trust, and there's not a regulatory trust. Next. And these are just some of the legal considerations that people have not even brought to the table yet, other than some trials that are just beginning. But these are emerging as AI gets used in healthcare and in other areas. Next. And the last thing I want to cover is we have such a gap. We can't even address some of this multidisciplinary or diversity to get a different perspective because we have such a paucity of diverse students going into data science and AI. Next. And at NIH, we're trying to mitigate that as well. And these are just a few examples of the data science fellowships that NIH offers, especially targeting minority students and students, sexual gender minorities, racial minorities, and first-generation college students in order to fill this gap. Next. And I would just like to close. Thank you that regardless of the color of who we are on the outside, just want to remind people that we are all the same on the inside.
Thank you, Dr. Duran and Dr. Lee. I appreciate this. Was really amazing, such a comprehensive look at the underlying gaps. I do have several questions, but Jeff, I want to, given that we are running out of time, is there a question in the from the audience that you want to pose?
Sure. The one I thought was perhaps more interesting was one that was posed by Catherine Mathis. She said, what kinds of accountability or expectations are there for commonly used large data sets that routinely have significant missing data? You know, either is there a way to repair them or a way to make sure that they're tagged or labeled so that people are aware of those biases? Perhaps Dr. Duran could answer that.
Yeah, there's not a way to tag them right now. And so consequently, you have to go in and do all of this discovery by yourself. This discovery is called data wrangling. And data wranglers take an extraordinary amount of time in order to go through data sets and create these structured data sets that include minorities. And sadly, there's not. But we also have to come up with better methodologies, not only to identify them, but to fix them.
I wonder, I know that Dr. Anderson has a hard stop. I understand our panelists actually are available to answer more questions. Dr. Anderson, did you want to say a few things before you turn into a pumpkin?
Certainly. Thank you, Jeff, and thank you, Shyam, and thank you to our speakers, Dr. Lee and Dr. Duran, for the really interesting talks that you gave. We look forward to partnering with REI, and I hope our guests enjoyed the presentations. Thank you, and again, we look forward to really adding to our programs at Howard and sharing with our community the wonders of data science and other disciplines and other topics that will be of interest to the community. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Anderson, for hosting this event. Jeff, are there other questions, or can I ask?
Yeah. I would say go ahead and ask one of your own, and then I can pose another one from the audience.
Okay. So Dr. Duran, my question was, as you emphasize the importance of the due diligence as these data elements, data is being curated, to me, the other aspect of it is once these algorithms and the underlying data appears as a solution to a challenge, what is the current state in terms of what you mentioned, the explainability? Because that's where a human being can come in and see what the machine is telling us. Does it make sense? What's the rationale behind it? Have you made good progress on that? I'm just curious, what have you seen?
Well, we haven't made good progress on it because there's been lots of AI applications that have been released to the public that have resulted in lots of harm. So we haven't made good progress on that part of it. But I think that the field in itself is really moving towards having AI check itself. And what better way to create recognition than to be able to see the patterns that we do. So we can recognize those patterns as human beings, right? We know, we can walk into a room and we know when someone talks to us based on our skin color or our last name or our anything about us, whatever ism we carry, we know when they're discriminating against us. And what we're trying to do is get the AI technology to do the same thing, to be able to know when there's discrimination going on, just as we can do that as a human being.
I see.
That's going to be our next generation of AI.
So the next question from a member of the audience is from Hassan Kareem, and he asks about Dr. Lee about the IRB processes for collecting social media data. And of course, that's the Institutional Review Board, where universities and research institutions make sure that people are aware they're part of an experiment or a research project and that people consent to it. Dr. Lee, can you describe if the IRB process has influence over the social media assessments that you've done?
Sure, that's a great question. So it depends on what site you're using. If you're using publicly available sites, the IRB process is very fast. They usually will give you an exempt or an expedited IRB in that process. If it's a closed Facebook site, it's much more difficult and challenging to access those types of data. But what we have found is that depending on the conversations, especially if it's a stigmatized condition, there are certain sites that are more rich than others. For example, Reddit has been incredibly interesting and useful because people can maintain their anonymity in those sites. So the IRB process is actually not that painful if you are looking for open sites.
Great. And I have a question that kind of relates to that. I've heard one or another agency in government has used analysis of social posts to be able to predict things like, hey, there's going to be a big flu outbreak near Houston because we've got lots of people Googling flu symptoms. So my question is whether or not there's been any experience that either of you have had using the social media analysis to be able to predict health disparities or likely changes in health status of folks of diverse groups or specific demographic groups of folks.
I do not know of any use for social media to identify health disparities. They have used social media to identify racism and discrimination acts, but not to look at what would an emerging health disparity be.
I think where social media comes into play is you can find out a lot about the social context of things. So delving a little bit deeper into understanding the social context of what is going on, I think that's quite interesting.
question that I think is hard to avoid, but someone said, Judy Fox said, there's so much fabulous information here. Can we get a copy of the slides?
Yes, it is our intent to, within the next 48 hours, we'll be sharing a recording as well as a copy of the slides after getting permission from our speakers. We'll be doing that.
I'm so very sorry. I have to jump off to another call. I'm so sorry. But I'm more than happy to take questions through email if anyone else has any more questions.
Sure. And
I can stay on to answer questions for another half hour.
Okay. I had one or two more questions. There are only kind of one or two more in the chat box, but my question for you, Dr. Duran, is if a student, for example, at Howard University wanted to put some energy into artificial intelligence and ideally to kind of think about ways to combat health disparities, where would you say the kind of top one or two or three areas and put their energy?
You cut out a little bit, so let me make sure I understand the question. Where would they go to look at health disparities?
If they wanted to think
AI,
about artificial intelligence and to be able to kind of put energy into a place that would be most valuable, what would you say is the most valuable place or area within the realm of AI where a student at Howard should put energy?
I would really encourage two things. One, to really become familiar with cloud computing, especially with Amazon and Google, because they are creating the major cloud platforms and they have all the tools that are currently available on these sites. The place, and the other thing that I would really encourage people interested in this is to really become familiar with Python or Spark, those kinds of programs that actually do the AI or the AI analyses. Once you have those skills, you can go to these data sets and pull all this data together and use it for the good of health disparities. But you have to have these skill sets. And this is where we have such a paucity of minority students or minority experts don't have these skill sets. And we need to have this. And if anyone is interested in pursuing this, you can email me directly and I will get you into many programs that can help pay for this, because we're doing fellowships and scholarships and trying to fill this gap.
Fantastic. Shem, did you have another question? I had one more, and
please go ahead.
Mike. Okay, so sure. My question, Dr. Duran, is we heard particularly from Dr. Lee and a little bit yourself about kind of social listening, kind of ingesting information from social media and kind of an understanding, evaluating, analyzing it. I wonder whether or not either NIH or, if you're aware, FDA or other components of government do any kind of pushing of information out on social media and essentially kind of evaluating where that might change behavior or where it might reduce health disparity. So kind of an evaluative analysis of communications that are outbound as opposed to inbound.
Yes, we actually are, all of NIH does that. Our communication offices in every of the institutes use LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook. They use all of these accounts, all the social media accounts to get out information. And they do analytics all the time on the effectiveness of of this strategy. So yes, that does happen at NIH all the time.
Great. So I think the last question that I see is from a gentleman, I believe, named Partha Jubaparu. And he asks, how do you separate noise from signal? Because it seems like sometimes one piece of information is just replicated or replayed many times by different information channels. How do you figure out whether it's kind of one thing being repeated or whether it's a lot of different pieces of information?
That's always a challenge, right? So I think that part of this is, and on one of the slides I gave how to look at like different data drifts and use of different programs. But the gist of it is that sometimes you, especially, and this is great that AI has given us this ability, is that sometimes you just have to run multiple code and changing the variables different times in order to see what is noise versus what is real. So there's not an easy way to do that right now. And that's where the human part comes in technology, because technology looks at everything as just data. But we as humans, we know that some things are noise. So that's where the human part has to come in. There's not a quick way to do that I know of anyway.
And that raises my own question. You know, many of us read about Russian internet social media posters trying to influence the election. You know, we know that there's clearly some racial division in the United States. Have there been instances that you or your colleagues have noticed where someone has been, you know, posting either false information or artificially inflammatory information in hopes of kind of damaging minority health? Are there bad actors out there on social media that are kind of playing in this space?
I don't know how to highlight anyone in particular, but I can assure you that there are bad actors everywhere trying to do everything. And I don't know that they're doing it so much in impacting minority health. I mean, just for example, look at how much media is out there on anti-vaccines for COVID.
Yeah.
I think that the bad actors are focused more on discrimination in general rather than health disparities.
Okay. Okay. I would be happy if there are folks, we still have 35, 37 folks in the audience. If there's someone who wants to raise their hand and ask a question, they're welcome to. Otherwise, I think we can say thank you to Dr. Duran and to Dr. Lee in retrospect for joining us. Does anyone in the audience remaining have a question that they would like to raise their hand and ask if I unmute them? And using our rule of thumb from within REI systems of kind of 7 seconds of silence means concurrence. Let me turn it over to you, Shem, to thank Dr. Duran and to close this.
Yeah, thank you so very much, Dr. Duran. Really amazing information, and I appreciate you taking your precious time to share it with us. And thank you to the folks in the audience for participating. Have a good afternoon. Enjoy your weekend. Be on the lookout for our next event as we plan and schedule that. Thank you.